Well, Jesus loved to teach that the world was the wrong side up. He would say, the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. That was great news for those in the back of the line. Not so good news for those who paid good money to get up front, to get to the top. You heard about the $10 tickets for Hamilton? I have no idea where those people were allowed to sit. Those who won the lottery and got to go to the show. But I would have loved it if those tickets brought them to the very first rows. And then I would have loved to look at the people who paid $400 or $500 for their tickets. Talk about turning the world right side up. The last shall be first. He told us that. Jesus often reminded us that people, especially those in power, he reminded them that God was prejudiced towards the poor, those who were at the bottom of the economic and social ladder. I've heard Father Jason say many times that in order to be a good Christian, one has to understand what it means to be a good Jew. And our lesson today is one of the ones where we really do need to know that. The Hebrew Scriptures are filled with God's instructions to the people regarding the treatment of those who have difficulty making their way in the world. In Deuteronomy, God established the rights of the poor to eat from their neighbor's field or from their neighbor's vineyard. They had a right to glean the crops after they were picked. They were free from interest on a loan. Think of what that would mean to today's payday lenders with their crippling interest rates. If the poor had to sell themselves to settle a debt or sell their land to settle a debt, they would be set free during the Sabbath year of release, and their land would be restored during the Jubilee year. According to Jeremiah, this was God's way of leveling the playing field and giving the poor an economic base essential to their livelihood and their personal liberty. In the book of Proverbs, we're told that God considers the poor and rich to be equal, and that the righteous person and the righteous king are expected to know the rights of the poor and defend them. Hear that again. In Proverbs it says that the righteous person and the righteous king are expected to know the rights of the poor and defend them. Now, our psalm today gives us a clue of how we should know such things. It says that we are to delight in the Lord's law and meditate on it day and night. We're to think about these things. We're to wonder how we can put God's law into action. By meditating on God's scriptures, we learn how to live. We learn how to treat each other, how to help God's kingdom break forth into the world. In other words, the world is wrong side up, and we're called to know that and then to turn it on its head. When Jesus told us to pray that God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, he's saying that it's our job to bring that about. With God's help, of course, but the work was ours to do. His disciples in the early church followed that lead, and we are to do the same. Years ago, I was leading a Bible study, and the topic of the poor came up. The discussion, and I was surprised at this, it became quite heated. One member said that he resented the fact that he who had worked hard all his life to have what he had, to reach the pinnacle of his field, was being asked to help the poor, the hungry, those who weep and mourn. He said they should pick themselves up by their own bootstraps, a feat that I feebly told him went against the laws of physics. He was not amused. The discussion reached its peak when he boomed, as it said in the Bible, God helps those who help themselves. And the room went quiet. And we shot glances at each other, and finally one of the quieter members of the group said, "That's not in the Bible." "What?" "It's not in the Bible. God never said that God helps those who help themselves. It's not in the Bible." "Well, it should be." We all decided it was time to go home. Skip the snacks, let's go home. There was one of those memes, as they call them, on Facebook the other day, and I tried to find it yesterday. I couldn't find it. Things disappear on Facebook. Most of it should, but this disappeared, and I was trying to find it. It has a picture of a guy sitting next to Jesus. And the guy's asking Jesus this: "Jesus, why is there hunger, fear, poverty, prejudice, and racism in the world?" Jesus answered, "Well, that's funny. I was going to ask you the same question." Why indeed? Have we moved so far from our Jewish roots and the teachings of Jesus that we forget what our role is in turning the world right side up again? While we're talking about thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, there's a story about heaven and hell. The story goes that a man dies, and of course he goes to St. Peter. I hope that's true, because every story has St. Peter doing this. So anyways, he dies. He goes to the, what kind of gates? Pearly gates, of course. And he's asked by St. Peter if he wants to go to heaven or hell. That day there's a choice. And he says, "Really? I didn't know there'd be a choice." He says, "Well, you want to see what they're like?" And he said, "Well, yeah. Let's go to hell first." So they go to hell, and as they arrive, they see this table that goes on for as far as the eye can see, and it's covered, piled up with food, luscious food, wonderful smelling food, breads and meats and vegetables and wine, and the people are seated on both sides of this magnificent table, this magnificent banquet feast. And then he notices something. They're not eating. And then he notices something else. All of their utensils are 6 feet long, and they can't eat. The guy said, "Well, I don't think I want to be here. Show me heaven." Well, they get to heaven, and there's a table as far as the eye can see, and it's covered with food and meat and bread and vegetables and wine, and people are lined up on both sides. But they too have utensils that are 6 feet long. And this guy goes, "St. Peter, I don't get it. It looks the same to me." And he said, "Oh, with one difference. In heaven, we feed each other." Huh? In heaven, we use our spoons to feed each other. Why is there hunger, fear, poverty, oppression? Because we fail to feed each other. Too often, we fail to feed each other. The Beatitudes that we read today are a promise of a future blessing. Yet it is a blessing that is, or at least should be, experienced now, even though God's kingdom hasn't fully shown up yet. It's one thing to say to the poor, "Well, just be patient. There's pie in the sky by and by." Or then to tell them to pick themselves up by their bootstraps, however that's supposed to work, or help themselves so that God will then in turn help them. But it's quite another to give the poor, the hungry, the needy, the strangers sojourning in our land a taste of God's kingdom right here, right now. The shape of God's future kingdom must shape our own here and now. It's the obligation of the righteous person, as we heard from Proverbs. It's the obligation of the righteous person, the righteous leader, to make sure that this happens to the best of their ability. One Sunday morning at the Church of the Epiphany in Urbana, I was greeted by, shall we say, an interesting guy. He walked up to me. He's carrying a beat-up guitar case. I said, "May I help you?" And he told me that his name was Willie and that God told him to come to that church that morning and preach. I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, we've got a problem." He said, "What's that?" "Well, God told me the same thing." He says, "Well, God also told me that if you wouldn't let me preach, that I should sing a song." I thought, what's the harm in that? What's the harm in that? Seemed like a nice guy. So reluctantly, I told him he could and that I'd introduce him. And so he went into the church. He set his guitar case down in the front pew and he sat down. And people murmured and they looked at each other. He was out of place. He really was out of place. One woman told me later that she was terrified of him. She assumed that inside that guitar case was an assault-style rifle, and that when he stood up, he would take us all out. Whew. Well, I preached my sermon, and I introduced him to the congregation and told him that Willie was asked by God to sing us a song, and I did it with a straight face. And why? Because who am I to say that God wasn't speaking to him? Who am I to say that that wasn't Christ in the stranger? So he opened his case, he slung his guitar over his shoulder, and he strummed it. I don't think that guitar could have been more out of tune if he had worked at it. He strummed it, and he began to sing his song over and over with a voice as out of tune as the guitar. "Sing a new song unto the Lord," he sang. "Sing a new song unto the Lord. Sing a new," and it went on. Those were the only words for well over 2 minutes. It was horrible. I'm being kind when I say it was horrible. And during the rest of the service, I steeled myself for the grief I knew I was going to catch. But to my surprise, several members of the congregation, as the service was ending, got up, went to him, and took him to coffee hour. And they took Willie around and introduced him to everybody there. And they fed him. He needed to be fed in lots of ways. They fed him. They fed him well. They shared their banquet with Willie. They shared with him a foretaste of the heavenly banquet that we all hope to share in someday. We learned a little bit about blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who weep and mourn. Willie was not the only person that day who got a foretaste of God's kingdom. We did as well, as we welcomed the stranger, fed him, shared with him the good news, and he with us sing a new song to the Lord. I was never more proud of that congregation than I was that morning. Someone came up to me as we were about to leave and said, "Don't forget what Jesus said. Whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do to me." Indeed. I'd like to point out one more thing. These Beatitudes were scandalous in their day. So scandalous that by the time Matthew got around to writing them down, he altered them. He altered the first one from "Blessed are the poor" to "Blessed are the poor in spirit." No, I think Luke got it right. Blessed are the poor. Period. Full stop. But how can the poor be blessed unless we do everything in our power to treat them with dignity and respect? How can the poor and the hungry be blessed unless we do all in our power to make sure that this abundance of food that we have on this planet does not go to waste and is shared and distributed with those in need? When this church feeds the hungry, you are doing God's work and helping the kingdom of God in heaven to break forth on this planet, here and now. It's not just a nice thing that you do so that you feel good about yourself. It's about building the kingdom of God. Not an earthly kingdom where the rich and powerful get their way to the detriment of the poor, but a reflection and foretaste of God's heavenly kingdom, when God will wipe away every tear, when there will be no more mourning and crying and pain, when no one goes hungry, when the rich and poor exist on a level playing field, when thy kingdom, God's kingdom, comes at last.